Grimsby Snodgrass never imagined that 17 words would bring the most feared military empire in the galaxy to its knees, begging for mercy and practical life advice. But then again, he never imagined he'd spend his Tuesday morning explaining to a 12-foot-tall alien warlord why tracking mud through a freshly mopped corridor was fundamentally worse than planetary genocide. The Vorthakian supremacy had been conquering worlds for over 3,000 years. Their battle cry could shatter reinforced titanium. Their war machines could reduce entire star systems to cosmic dust. Their supreme overlord, Bruticus Devastan IX, had personally overseen the subjugation of 427 civilizations. None of this mattered to Grimsby, who was far too busy scrubbing purple slime off the walls of Maintenance Corridor C7 to pay attention to yet another apocalyptic invasion announcement echoing through the speakers of Nexus Station Alpha. Nexus Station Alpha was, according to its official designation, the most important diplomatic hub in 17 sectors. According to Grimsby, it was the universe's largest collection of beings who had never learned to clean up after themselves. The station housed delegates from 93 different species, each one seemingly determined to leave behind biological evidence of their visit in the most inconvenient places possible. Take the Blobotherians, for instance. Lovely people, very philosophical, excellent at mediating trade disputes. Unfortunately, they secreted a substance that smelled like a combination of rotting fish and existential dread, and it ate through standard cleaning solvents like acid through tissue paper. Or consider the crystalline harmonizers from the Rigel system. Beautiful voices could sing agreements into existence through pure sonic manipulation. The downside: their natural resonance frequency caused every piece of glassware within a 3-kilometer radius to vibrate constantly, creating a sound that made dental drills seem soothing by comparison. And then there were the tentacloids from Proxima 7. Brilliant strategists, unparalleled military tacticians, absolutely useless at remembering that their slime trails became toxic when exposed to artificial lighting for more than 6 hours. But Grimsby had developed systems, beautiful, elegant, mathematically precise systems that accounted for every possible biological quirk, cultural taboo, and cleaning challenge that the galaxy could throw at him. He maintained detailed charts showing which species molted on which days, who secreted what substances under stress, and which combinations of alien biology would result in chemical reactions that could potentially violate several laws of physics. His supply closets were organized with the precision of a master librarian and the paranoia of someone who had once spent 4 hours cleaning up after a quantum digestive incident involving 3 different species and a diplomatic lunch gone horribly wrong. Grimsby hadn't always been a janitor. 15 years ago, he had been Dr. Grimsby Snodgrass, holder of advanced degrees in interspecies psychology, diplomatic protocol, and applied xenobiology. He had served as cultural liaison to the Andromedan Trade Confederation, successfully negotiated the Peace of 7 Suns, and once convinced 2 warring species to stop fighting by pointing out that they were both using the wrong verb tense in their battle cries. But after a decade of watching politicians turn elegant solutions into bureaucratic nightmares, watching simple misunderstandings escalate into sector-wide conflicts because nobody wanted to admit they didn't understand what someone else meant, Grimsby had experienced what he later described as a moment of cosmic clarity. The revelation had come during a particularly frustrating negotiation between the Mercurian Collective and the Jovian Republic. Both sides had been arguing for 17 hours about territorial boundaries, trade routes, and historical grievances, when Grimsby suddenly realized that the entire conflict could be resolved if someone would just clean the conference room windows. The Mercurians, you see, communicated partially through subtle color variations in their skin, which were being distorted by the grimy windows. The Jovians were interpreting these distorted colors as insults, which explained why they kept making increasingly aggressive diplomatic statements. Grimsby had quietly slipped out of the conference room, found a bottle of window cleaner, and spent 20 minutes making the transparasteel spotless. When he returned, both sides immediately realized their miscommunication and signed a trade agreement within the hour. That night, Grimsby had sat in his quarters, staring at the cleaning supplies he'd used to prevent what could have been a devastating war, and realized that he'd found his true calling. The next morning, he submitted his resignation from the diplomatic corps and applied for a position in station maintenance. His colleagues thought he'd suffered a nervous breakdown. His superiors tried to convince him he was throwing away a brilliant career. His mother sent him 17 increasingly concerned subspace messages asking if he was eating properly and whether he needed her to come visit. But Grimsby had never been happier. In maintenance, problems were straightforward. Mess appears, you clean it up, everyone's day gets a little better. No politics, no hidden agendas, no carefully worded treaties that meant 17 different things depending on which species was reading them. Just practical problems with practical solutions. This particular morning, Grimsby was implementing Solution Protocol Gamma 7 for Blobotherian residue removal when the invasion began. The first sign was the usual dramatic dimming of station lighting that apparently came standard with all military threats. Grimsby had seen this enough times to know that someone was trying to create atmosphere for their big announcement. The second sign was the activation of the emergency broadcast system, which crackled to life with that particular combination of static and self-importance that indicated someone very powerful was about to say something they thought was terribly impressive. Attention, primitive life forms of Nexus Station Alpha. The voice that echoed through every speaker on the station belonged to Supreme Overlord Bruticus Devaston IX, though Grimsby wouldn't learn this until later. At the moment, he was primarily concerned with the fact that the dramatic volume increase had startled the Blobotherians in Section D, causing them to release anxiety secretions that were already beginning to eat through the deck plating. I am Bruticus Devaston IX, Supreme Overlord of the Vorthakian Supremacy, Destroyer of Worlds, Crusher of Hopes, and winner of the Galactic Intimidation Championship for 7 consecutive cycles. Grimsby paused in his scrubbing to consider this announcement. In his experience, anyone who needed to list that many titles in their introduction was usually compensating for something. The most effective leaders he'd known had been able to accomplish quite a lot with simple phrases like, "Please" and "Thank you." Your pathetic station is now under the dominion of the Vorthakian Supremacy. You have precisely 30 minutes to surrender unconditionally, evacuate all personnel to designated holding areas, and prepare for immediate incorporation into our glorious empire. The announcement continued with several more minutes of creative threats, dramatic pauses, and what sounded like a full orchestra providing background music. Grimsby had to admit it was professionally produced. Whoever was in charge of the Vorthakian Supremacy's media department clearly took their work seriously. Throughout the station, the various diplomatic delegations were responding with their species' traditional panic behaviors. The crystalline harmonizers began singing funeral dirges that made the walls vibrate ominously. The tentacloids immediately began secreting defensive slime, which would become toxic in approximately 5 hours and 43 minutes if Grimsby didn't get to it soon. Ambassador Flibbergast of the Centaurian Commonwealth locked himself in his quarters and began composing what he was certain would be his final report to headquarters, a document that would later be studied by xenopsychologists as a masterpiece of bureaucratic despair. But the most problematic reaction came from the Blobotherians, who responded to stress by entering what they called enhanced philosophical mode, which unfortunately involved secreting approximately 3 times their normal volume of existential dread slime while engaging in deep discussions about the meaning of suffering. Within 15 minutes, Maintenance Corridor C7 looked like the site of a chemical warfare experiment conducted by particularly depressed scientists. Grimsby surveyed the damage and sighed. This was exactly the sort of thing that happened when people let their emotions override practical thinking. The Blubbertharians weren't actually in any immediate danger. If the Vorthakians were anything like the previous 15 invasion forces he'd witnessed, they'd spend at least an hour on dramatic posturing before actually boarding the station. But explaining this to highly stressed aliens who were currently leaking caustic philosophy onto his nice, clean floors would take more time than he had available. He was just beginning to calculate the optimal cleaning sequence for existential dread removal when the boarding began. Grimsby had to admit the Vorthakians knew how to make an entrance. Their docking procedures were executed with military precision, their airlocks sealed with satisfying mechanical clicks, and their boarding ramps deployed with the kind of dramatically appropriate lighting that suggested someone had put considerable thought into the visual presentation. The first wave of Vorthakian soldiers marched into Nexus Station Alpha wearing armor that gleamed like polished obsidian and carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained destructive energy. Their boots struck the deck plates with rhythmic precision that would have been quite impressive if they hadn't immediately begun tracking mud through Grimsby's freshly cleaned corridors. The lead soldier was a magnificent specimen of Vorthakian military breeding. Standing 8 feet tall with skin the color of burnished copper and wearing enough medals to stock a small trophy shop, General Maximus Crushinator commanded attention simply by existing in the same space as other beings. He strode through the station corridors with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through strategic application of overwhelming force. His weapon, a device that looked like someone had crossed a lightning bolt with a bad attitude, swept back and forth as he searched for signs of resistance. He found Grimsby in Maintenance Corridor C7, calmly spraying neutralizing solution on the latest batch of Blubbertharian anxiety secretions. "Halt, inferior being!" General Crushinator's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "By order of the Vorthakian supremacy, you are now a prisoner of war." Grimsby looked up from his work, took in the general's impressive appearance, noted the muddy footprints leading back down the corridor, and felt his left eye begin to twitch. "You're going to need to take your boots off," he said calmly. The general's weapon wavered slightly. "What? Boots? Off? I just finished cleaning this section, and you're tracking mud everywhere." Grimsby gestured toward a sign mounted on the nearby wall. Regulation 847C clearly states that all personnel entering Maintenance Corridor C7 must use appropriate footwear protection. General Crushinator looked at the sign, which was written in 47 languages and included helpful pictographs showing proper cleaning procedures. He looked down at his boots, which were indeed leaving muddy prints on the spotless floor. He looked back at Grimsby, who was waiting with the patient expression of someone who had explained this rule approximately 4,000 times to various species and was prepared to explain it 4,000 more times if necessary. We're conquering this station." "Yes, I heard the announcement. Very thorough. Excellent production values. Now boots off, please, or I'll have to write you up for a sanitation violation." The general's communication device crackled to life as his bewilderment was transmitted back to the command ship. "General Crushinator, report. What is your status?" "Supreme Overlord, sir. We've encountered unusual resistance." On the bridge of the Vorthakian flagship, Bruticus Devastan IX leaned forward in his command throne. The Supreme Overlord was an impressive figure even by Vorthakian standards. 12 feet of carefully sculpted muscle and strategic scarring, wearing ceremonial armor that had been forged from the hulls of defeated enemy ships. "Describe their defensive capabilities, General." "Well, sir, they appear to have very strict hygiene regulations." There was a pause that stretched across the vacuum of space like an awkward silence at a diplomatic dinner party. "Come again." "The human is insisting we remove our footwear before proceeding with the conquest, sir. Something about tracking mud through a clean corridor." Bruticus looked around his command bridge, where his most trusted advisors were staring at the communication array with expressions of profound confusion. In 3,000 years of galactic conquest, the Vorthakian supremacy had encountered energy shields, quantum weapon arrays, reality-warping defense systems, and one memorable opponent who had tried to defeat them through interpretive dance. Nobody had ever asked them to take their shoes off. Is this some form of psychological warfare, General? I honestly don't know, sir. He seems genuinely concerned about floor maintenance. Meanwhile, back in maintenance corridor C7, Grimsby was reaching the limits of his patience. The Blobotherian slime was approaching its toxic phase. The crystalline harmonizers were still singing their funeral dirges, and now he had an entire platoon of heavily armed aliens standing in his corridor, wearing muddy boots and looking confused. "Look," Grimsby said, setting down his cleaning sprayer and facing the general with the expression of someone who was about to deliver a lecture that had been building up for 15 years of dealing with inconsiderate visitors. "I understand that you're here to conquer us. I get that this is probably very important to you and your career advancement. But I've been cleaning these corridors for 7 years, and in all that time I have never had anyone from any species, representing any government, carrying any level of diplomatic immunity, show such complete disregard for basic sanitation protocols." General Crushinator took an involuntary step backward. There was something in the human's voice that triggered instincts he didn't know he possessed. Instincts that suggested that disappointing this particular being might have consequences that went beyond mere military defeat. "Sir," he whispered into his communicator, "I think we might have a significant problem here." The communication channel crackled as Bruticus himself appeared on a nearby display screen, his scarred features twisted into an expression of barely controlled fury. "Human!" the Supreme Overlord roared, his voice carrying enough volume to make the corridor walls vibrate sympathetically. "I am Bruticus Devastan the Ninth. I have conquered 427 civilizations. I have personally destroyed 18 star systems. I have 427 civilizations," Grimsby interrupted, his voice rising to a level that made several nearby crystalline harmonizers stop their funeral singing and start paying attention. "And you've never learned basic courtesy?" The question hit the Vorthakian command structure like a philosophical asteroid. Across the invasion fleet, officers found themselves accessing their conquest databases, reviewing their standard operating procedures, and slowly realizing that in all their centuries of military expansion, the concept of being polite to the people they were conquering had never actually come up. Bruticus's scarred features contorted as he processed this unprecedented challenge to his worldview. "Courtesy is for the weak. We are conquerors. We take what we want and track mud through other people's homes while you're doing it." Grimsby's voice had now reached the level that maintenance supervisors throughout the galaxy recognized as the sound of someone who had reached their limit. "Do you have any idea what it takes to maintain a multi-species facility? The Blobotherians alone require 17 different neutralizing agents, and that's just for their normal secretions. When they're stressed, they leak existential philosophy that can eat through titanium." He gestured wildly at the corridor around them, where evidence of various alien panic responses was becoming increasingly visible. "The tentacloids are generating toxic slime that will start melting bulkheads in 4 hours. The crystalline harmonizers haven't stopped that funeral singing, which means every piece of glassware on the station is going to shatter if this keeps up. And the Flurborgs have locked themselves in the waste processing center, which means that if I don't get down there in the next 20 minutes to talk them out, we're going to have a sewage backup that will make this invasion look like a minor inconvenience." The absolute fury in the human's voice was being transmitted directly to the Vorthakian command ship, where it was having an effect that no weapon in their arsenal had ever achieved. For the first time in his career, Supreme Overlord Bruticus Devastan the Ninth was beginning to feel something that might have been guilt. But But we're supposed to cause fear and chaos. That's how conquest works. No, that's how inefficient conquest works, Grimsby shot back. You want to know what real power looks like? Real power is getting people to want to cooperate with you. Real power is solving problems instead of creating them. Real power is having enough respect for other people's efforts that you don't march into their home and make a mess they'll have to clean up after you're gone. The silence that followed was the kind of silence typically associated with religious revelations, paradigm shifts, and the moment when someone realizes that everything they thought they knew about life was completely wrong. General Crushinator slowly began unlacing his boots. He didn't know why he was doing it. Some deep, instinctive part of his brain was telling him that this was the right thing to do. That's better, Grimsby said, his voice dropping back to more reasonable levels. Now, if you're going to be here for a while, we need to establish some ground rules. And that's when Grimsby said it. The 17 words that would echo through Vorthakian military academies for the next 1,000 years. The simple observation that would cause the greatest invasion force in galactic history to question everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the proper way to treat other people's property. Honestly, you'd think a civilization advanced enough for space travel would know better. The words hung in the recycled atmosphere like a cosmic judgment. On the command ship, Bruticus Devaston IX felt his 12-foot frame begin to sway as the full implications of what the human had just said sank in. Because, you see, the Supreme Overlord had been thinking the exact same thing about his own people for the past 50 years. The Vorthakian supremacy was, technically speaking, one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. They had mastered faster-than-light travel, developed weapons that could crack planets, and built an empire that spanned 3 sectors. They had also, Bruticus was suddenly realizing, never figured out how to expand that empire without making everyone in it miserable. Every conquered world required massive occupation forces to keep the population in line. Every victory brought new rebellions, new resistance movements, new problems that required ever-increasing amounts of military resources to solve. The Vorthakian supremacy was spending more energy controlling their empire than they were getting out of it. And in all their centuries of conquest, it had never occurred to any of them that maybe, just maybe, this was because they were doing it wrong. By the sacred battle scars of our ancestors, he whispered, accessing statistical data from across his empire. We've been making enemies everywhere we go. The numbers appearing on his personal display were not encouraging. Rebellion rates, 84% across all conquered territories. Resource productivity, 23% below optimistic projections. Military forces dedicated to occupation duty, 91% of total fleet capacity. Sir, General Crushinator's voice came through the communicator, now carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there during the dramatic boarding action. The human. He wants to know if we've considered asking planets to join the Empire instead of just conquering them. Asking? Bruticus roared, then paused as he realized that his automatic outrage might not be entirely rational. Why would we ask? He says willing participants are more productive than forced ones, sir. And you don't have to spend resources keeping them in line. The concept was so simple that it was revolutionary. Instead of forcing civilizations to join their empire, the Vorthakians could simply ask. And if a world said no, they could find other worlds that said yes. It's actually more efficient, General Crushinator continued, relaying Grimsby's ongoing lecture. He's showing me statistical models that suggest voluntary participation increases productivity by an average of 340%, while reducing administrative overhead by 67%. Bruticus found himself leaning forward in his command throne, genuinely interested for the first time in decades. What else is he saying? He's explaining something called basic courtesy protocols. Apparently, if you treat people with respect, they're more likely to cooperate. Who knew? Who knew indeed? In all his years of military academy training, strategic planning sessions, and conquest briefings, the concept of treating conquered peoples with respect had never come up. The Vorthakian military philosophy was built around the assumption that fear and intimidation were the only reliable tools for maintaining control. But this human was suggesting that there might be alternatives. General, I want you to continue gathering intelligence from this human. Find out everything he knows about efficient governance and resource management. Sir, he's now explaining something called damage control. Apparently, when you enter someone else's space, you're supposed to minimize disruption and clean up after yourself. He says it's basic hospitality. Hospitality! The word rolled around in Bruticus's mind like a foreign concept that might actually make sense if he thought about it long enough. Throughout the invasion fleet, similar conversations were taking place as Vorthakian officers found themselves in unprecedented situations. Captain Destructor Megablast was having an earnest discussion with a tentacloid diplomat about proper slime disposal procedures. Commander Annihilation Thunderstrike was learning about the cultural significance of funeral singing from a group of crystalline harmonizers who were actually quite pleasant once you got them talking about something other than imminent death. Most surprisingly, Colonel Devastation Maximus had discovered that the Blobotherians were actually eager to share their philosophical insights, provided someone was willing to help clean up their stress secretions first. Sir, General Crushinator reported, the human has offered to show us proper station maintenance procedures. He says that if we're going to be here, we might as well make ourselves useful. Make ourselves useful? Apparently, sir, there's a concept called contributing to the community that involves actually helping with local problems instead of creating new ones. The idea was so alien to traditional Vorthakian thinking that several bridge officers needed to sit down. But as the reports continued to flow in from throughout the station, a pattern was beginning to emerge. Every Vorthakian soldier who had started helping with cleanup and maintenance was discovering that the local inhabitants were actually quite friendly and interesting once you got past the initial terror of being conquered. General, Bruticus said slowly, I want you to implement full cooperation protocols with the human. Learn everything he's willing to teach us. Sir, he's offered to show us his filing system for multi-species biological requirements. Apparently, proper record-keeping is essential for efficient facility management. Do it. Over the next several hours, the most feared invasion force in 3 sectors underwent the most rapid cultural transformation in recorded galactic history. Vorthakian soldiers found themselves learning the proper procedures for Blobotherian anxiety management, tentacloid slime neutralization, and crystalline harmonizer frequency modulation. They discovered that most of the primitive species they had dismissed were actually quite sophisticated once you took the time to understand their perspectives. General Crushinator, now wearing borrowed maintenance coveralls and carrying a specialized cleaning kit, was having the most educational experience of his military career. So, the key, Grimsby was explaining while demonstrating proper existential slime removal technique, is understanding that every species has different stress responses. The Blobotherians leak philosophy when they're worried. The tentacloids generate defensive toxins. The crystalline harmonizers sing funeral songs. None of this is personal. It's just biology. But how do you manage all of them at once? Systems, Grimsby said with the satisfaction of someone sharing hard-won expertise. You anticipate problems before they happen, you maintain proper supplies for every situation, and you remember that most conflicts come down to misunderstandings that can be solved with clear communication and basic courtesy. The general was furiously taking notes on his tactical data pad. And the efficiency improvements you mentioned? Think about it, Grimsby continued, now moving on to demonstrate proper harmonizer frequency dampening procedures. When people are comfortable and their needs are being met, they're productive. When they're stressed, scared, or angry, they create problems that require more resources to solve than you get back from their participation. D. As if to illustrate this point, the Blobotharians in Section D had stopped their stress secretions entirely once they realized the Vorthakians were genuinely trying to help with cleanup. Instead of leaking existential dread, they had begun sharing their philosophical insights about efficient governance, which turned out to be, surprisingly, practical. They've developed some interesting theories about resource allocation, General Crushinator reported to the command ship. Apparently, optimal productivity requires what they call reciprocal consideration, the idea that everyone benefits when everyone's needs are being met. Bruticus was beginning to suspect that his empire had been operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about how societies actually worked. What about the other species? The tentacloids are sharing their strategic planning methodologies, sir. Turns out they're not just good at military tactics, they're excellent at logistics and supply chain management, and the crystalline harmonizers have offered to teach us their consensus-building techniques. For a civilization that had spent 3,000 years believing that fear was the only reliable tool for maintaining order, these discoveries were nothing short of revolutionary. Sir, the general continued, the human has asked if we'd be interested in attending what he calls a community meeting to discuss long-term cooperation protocols. A meeting? Apparently, sir, it's a process where everyone gets together, shares their perspectives, and works out mutually beneficial arrangements. He says it's more efficient than conquest because everyone involved is motivated to make the arrangements work. The concept of voluntary cooperation was so foreign to Vorthakian military doctrine that Bruticus had to access his strategic databases just to confirm that such a thing was theoretically possible. But the data was unmistakable. Every report from the station was showing improved cooperation, increased productivity, and what the humans apparently called positive morale indicators. General, Bruticus said finally, I want you to accept the human's invitation to this meeting, and I want you to ask him if he would be willing to consult on empire-wide policy improvements. Sir, he's already mentioned that he has some ideas about what he calls diplomatic optimization. Apparently, most interspecies conflicts can be prevented through proper communication protocols and cultural sensitivity training. 3 months ago, Bruticus would have considered such a concept laughably weak. Now, looking at the efficiency reports streaming in from Nexus Station Alpha, he was beginning to think it might be the most powerful weapon his empire had never thought to use. The transformation continued throughout the day. Vorthakian engineers worked alongside Flurborg sanitation specialists to optimize the station's waste processing systems. Vorthakian tactical officers collaborated with tentacloid strategists to develop improved traffic flow patterns through the main corridors. Even Bruticus himself eventually transported down to the station to observe these unprecedented developments firsthand. He found Grimsby in the main conference room, leading what appeared to be the most productive diplomatic session in the station's history. Representatives from all 93 species were present, along with Vorthakian officers, who were taking detailed notes on everything from proper meeting etiquette to advanced consensus-building techniques. Supreme Overlord Bruticus, Grimsby said, looking up from a comprehensive chart showing optimal waste disposal schedules for mixed-species facilities. I was hoping you'd join us. We're discussing some ideas for improving interspecies cooperation on a larger scale. Bruticus looked around the conference room, where his most feared military commanders were engaged in earnest discussions about cultural exchange programs, resource-sharing agreements, and what the Blobotharians were calling philosophical cooperation protocols. Human, he said slowly, what have you done to my empire? Well, Grimsby replied thoughtfully, I think we've just helped it become more efficient. And that was when Bruticus Devaston IX, Supreme Overlord of the Vorthakian supremacy, made a decision that would reshape galactic politics for the next millennium. He sat down in one of the conference room chairs, pulled out his own data pad, and said, "Tell me more about these efficiency improvements." The session that followed would later be studied in diplomatic academies as a masterpiece of practical problem-solving. Grimsby, with his background in xenodiplomacy and his hard-earned expertise in multi-species facility management, walked the assembled group through a comprehensive analysis of what he called sustainable expansion protocols. Instead of conquest, he proposed invitation. Instead of occupation, he suggested cooperation. Instead of ruling through fear, he recommended governing through mutual benefit. The ideas were simple, practical, and revolutionary. The key insight, Grimsby explained, is that sustainable growth requires willing participation. When people choose to be part of something, they contribute more and cause fewer problems than when they're forced to participate. He pulled up statistical models showing resource allocation efficiency under different governance scenarios. The numbers were unambiguous. Voluntary cooperation consistently outperformed forced compliance across every metric that mattered. "But how do you convince people to join voluntarily?" asked Commander Devastation Maximus, who had spent the afternoon learning advanced slime neutralization techniques from a tentacloid engineer. "You demonstrate value," Grimsby replied. "You show them that being part of your organization will make their lives better. You solve their problems, contribute to their communities, and prove through your actions that you're worthy of their trust." The concept was so straightforward that it was profound. Instead of demanding submission, the Vorthakians could earn cooperation. Instead of creating fear, they could build relationships. The Blobotherians have some interesting philosophical frameworks that support this approach, added Ambassador Flibbergast, who had emerged from his quarters once he realized that the invasion had somehow transformed into the most productive diplomatic conference of his career. They call it mutually beneficial existence optimization. The tentacloids have strategic models that show how cooperative networks are more resilient than hierarchical control systems, contributed Captain Destructor Megablast, who had spent 2 hours learning about distributed leadership principles and was finding them surprisingly compelling. And the crystalline harmonizers have consensus-building techniques that can resolve conflicts more efficiently than traditional negotiation methods, added Colonel Annihilation Thunderstrike, who had discovered that funeral songs were actually quite soothing once you understood their cultural context. As the discussion continued, Bruticus found himself taking notes with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered that there were solutions to problems he hadn't even realized he'd been trying to solve. The Vorthakian supremacy had been struggling with the challenges of empire management for centuries. Rebellions, resource shortages, administrative overhead, and the constant need to deploy military forces to maintain control had been draining their civilization's energy and resources. But this human janitor was suggesting that all of these problems could be addressed through better organizational principles and more thoughtful relationship management. "What would you recommend as a first step?" Bruticus asked. Grimsby considered this carefully. "Start with the worlds that are most unhappy with current arrangements. Send diplomatic teams, not military forces, to find out what problems they're facing and what improvements they'd like to see. Then work with them to develop solutions that benefit everyone involved. And if they refuse to cooperate, then you respect their decision and focus your energy on working with communities that want to participate. There are plenty of civilizations in the galaxy. Find ones that share your values and want to be part of something bigger." The approach was so fundamentally different from traditional Vorthakian strategy that it took several minutes for the full implications to sink in. Instead of forcing unwilling participants to comply with imperial directives, they could build coalitions of willing partners who shared common goals. Instead of spending resources on occupation forces, they could invest in infrastructure and improvements that benefited everyone involved. It's actually more efficient, Bruticus realized, his 17 battle scars seeming somehow less important than they had that morning. We've been wasting enormous amounts of energy trying to control people who didn't want to be controlled. Exactly, Grimsby nodded. And the energy you save by not fighting reluctant participants can be invested in building better relationships with willing ones. Dre. The meeting continued for several more hours, during which the assembled representatives developed what would later be known as the Nexus Accords, a comprehensive framework for interspecies cooperation based on mutual benefit, voluntary participation, and what the Blobotharians insisted on calling practical wisdom optimization. By the time the session concluded, the Vorthakian supremacy had officially transformed from a conquest-based empire into what Grimsby suggested they call the Vorthakian Cooperative Alliance. The change was more than cosmetic. Over the following weeks, Vorthakian diplomatic teams, accompanied by experienced maintenance specialists who understood the importance of making good first impressions, visited every world in their empire to assess local needs and develop cooperative improvement plans. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Worlds that had been in constant rebellion for centuries suddenly became enthusiastic participants once they realized their perspectives were being heard and their problems were being addressed. Resource productivity increased by an average of 400% as communities redirected their energy from resistance activities to collaborative projects. Administrative overhead dropped by 73% as local governments took on responsibilities that had previously required imperial oversight. Most remarkably, the Vorthakian military found themselves with unprecedented free time as occupation duties became unnecessary. Instead of maintaining control through force, they transitioned into roles as problem solvers, infrastructure developers, and what Grimsby called community support specialists. But the real transformation was cultural. The Vorthakians discovered that there were more interesting ways to spend their time than conquest. They developed exchange programs with other civilizations, collaborative research projects, and what the crystalline harmonizers called harmony optimization initiatives. Bruticus himself took on the role of Chief Cooperation Officer, a position that involved visiting member worlds to assess needs, coordinate resources, and ensure that everyone's contributions were being properly valued and utilized. The galaxy watched these developments with fascination, confusion, and in some cases, nervous anticipation. The transformation of the Vorthakian supremacy from a feared military empire into a cooperative alliance was unprecedented in recorded galactic history. Other civilizations began requesting information about the Nexus Protocol and asking whether they might be eligible to participate in the alliance. Trade relationships flourished as worlds that had previously been too intimidated to approach Vorthakian space began exploring opportunities for beneficial cooperation. Grimsby, meanwhile, had been promoted to Chief of Interspecies Relations and Practical Problem Resolution, a position that came with a larger office, an unlimited supply budget, and a staff of 47 assistant janitors from various species who had all requested transfers specifically to work under his supervision. But he still insisted on personally handling the most challenging cleaning situations. Some problems, he maintained, required the attention of someone who truly understood the relationship between environmental maintenance and social stability. 3 months after what historians would later call the Great Custodial Revelation, Grimsby was back in Maintenance Corridor C7, applying a new formula he'd developed for removing quantum philosophy residue, a particularly stubborn substance that the Blobotharians had started producing ever since they'd become excited about their role in galactic diplomatic theory. The corridor was busier now. Representatives from 17 different civilizations had requested permission to establish permanent diplomatic offices on Nexus Station Alpha, specifically because they wanted to observe and participate in what everyone was calling the Grimsby method of interspecies cooperation. The station itself had undergone remarkable improvements. The Vorthakian engineers, working in collaboration with specialists from member civilizations, had developed revolutionary new life support systems that could accommodate the biological needs of over 200 different species simultaneously. The tentacloids had contributed advanced filtration technology. The crystalline harmonizers had designed acoustic systems that could modulate frequencies to create optimal working environments for everyone. Even the bathrooms had been revolutionized, though Grimsby preferred not to discuss those particular innovations in polite company. But the most significant change was philosophical. Throughout the galaxy, other civilizations were beginning to experiment with what academic institutions were calling custodial governance theory, the radical idea that effective leadership involved cleaning up problems rather than creating them. The Andromedan Trade Federation had restructured their entire diplomatic corps around principles of practical courtesy. The Centaurian Commonwealth had established a new government department specifically dedicated to interspecies maintenance relations. Even the notoriously aggressive Rigelian Empire had begun sending their military officers to attend workshops on constructive intervention protocols. The transformation was so widespread that several universities had established new academic departments devoted to studying what they called applied janitorial philosophy. Grimsby found all of this attention somewhat bemusing. As far as he was concerned, he hadn't revolutionized anything. He'd simply applied common sense and basic courtesy to problems that had been unnecessarily complicated by people who thought complexity was more impressive than effectiveness. He was contemplating this while scrubbing a particularly interesting stain that appeared to be some sort of fossilized diplomatic confusion, a substance that formed when 3 or more species tried to negotiate without proper translation protocols. When his communication device chimed, "Chief Grimsby," came the voice of his assistant, a remarkably organized Fleurbourg named Efficiency Specialist Blorbsworth. "You have a priority communication from the Galactic Cooperative Council." The Galactic Cooperative Council was a new organization that had formed spontaneously as more civilizations adopted cooperative governance models. They had requested Grimsby's input on establishing galaxy-wide standards for interspecies facility management, diplomatic courtesy protocols, and what they were calling universal maintenance ethics. "Put them through," Grimsby said, not pausing in his stain removal efforts. The voice that crackled through his communicator belonged to Chancellor Harmonious Optimiswick of the United Cooperative Civilizations, an organization that now included over 300 member worlds. "Chief Grimsby, we have a situation that requires your expertise." "What kind of situation?" "The destructive conquest empire of malicious intent has been observing our cooperative expansion protocols. They've concluded that our methods are more effective than their traditional approaches, and they're requesting guidance on transitioning to cooperative governance models." Grimsby paused in his scrubbing. The destructive conquest empire was notorious throughout the galaxy for their commitment to aggressive territorial expansion and their complete disregard for the property rights of other civilizations. "Let me guess," he said. "They want to know if they can join the cooperative alliance without actually changing any of their fundamental behaviors." "That's remarkably accurate. How did you know?" "I've been dealing with the same attitude from visiting diplomats for 15 years. Everyone wants the benefits of cooperation, but nobody wants to do the work of actually being cooperative." There was a pause as Chancellor Optimiswick consulted with his advisory committee, a process that involved several different species and produced a harmonious humming sound that Grimsby had learned to recognize as constructive deliberation. "What would you recommend?" Grimsby considered this while examining the fossilized diplomatic confusion, which was showing signs of responding to his latest solvent formula. "Same approach as always. Send them the basic requirements for cooperative participation, respect for other civilizations' autonomy, commitment to mutual benefit rather than one-sided advantage, and willingness to contribute to community problem-solving rather than just creating new problems for other people to deal with. And if they're not willing to accept those requirements, then they're not ready for cooperative membership. Focus your energy on civilizations that actually want to participate constructively. Indeed, the conversation continued for several more minutes, during which Grimsby provided detailed recommendations for dealing with what he called conversion-resistant aggressive civilizations. Basically, organizations that wanted to join cooperative alliances without giving up their destructive behaviors. After the call ended, Grimsby returned to his stain removal project, reflecting on how familiar these patterns had become. Whether he was dealing with messy alien biology or messy galactic politics, the fundamental principles remained the same. Identify the source of the problem, apply appropriate cleaning solutions, and maintain consistent standards for acceptable behavior. His philosophical contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Ambassador Globnik, who was carrying a datapad and wearing the expression of someone who had just encountered something that defied conventional categorization. "Chief Grimsby," the ambassador said, "I've just received the most remarkable communication from the Archive of Galactic Historical Records." "Oh?" "They want to officially classify the events of 3 months ago as the most significant diplomatic revolution in recorded history. Apparently, your conversation with Supreme Overlord Bruticus has been studied by political scientists throughout the galaxy." Grimsby looked up from the now clean section of corridor flooring. "What are they saying about it?" "Well, according to Professor Intellecticus Theoretrix of the Andromedan Institute of Advanced Political Analysis, you've fundamentally redefined the relationship between power and responsibility in interspecies governance. I told them to take their shoes off and clean up their messes." "Yes, but the implications—" Ambassador Globnik consulted his datapad with the excitement of someone who had discovered a particularly interesting footnote in a tax code. "Your approach has been analyzed as a practical application of what they're calling reciprocal consideration theory, combined with environmental stewardship leadership principles and applied custodial wisdom." Grimsby resumed his cleaning activities. "Sounds like they're making it more complicated than it needs to be. But that's exactly what Professor Theoretrix finds so remarkable. She says that your methodology demonstrates that the most effective solutions are often the simplest ones, and that complexity is frequently a symptom of people trying to avoid basic responsibilities rather than fulfill them. The observation was accurate enough that Grimsby paused to consider it. In his experience, the most persistent problems were usually caused by people who preferred elaborate justifications for bad behavior over simple commitments to good behavior. "Chief Grimsby," Ambassador Globnik continued, "they want to establish a permanent research institute dedicated to studying your methods, the Grimsby Institute for Practical Diplomatic Solutions." "Do they have to use my name?" "Well, what would you prefer?" Grimsby thought about this while applying neutralizing solution to a section where someone had recently tracked in some sort of philosophical residue from the Blobotherian quarters. "How about the Institute for Cleaning Up Your Own Messes?" Ambassador Globnik made a note on his datapad. "I'll suggest that as an alternative." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Efficiency Maximizer, formerly General Crushinator, who was now serving as the Vorthakian Alliance's Chief of Interspecies Facility Coordination. He was wearing maintenance coveralls that had been decorated with medals, representing his achievements in advanced cleaning techniques, diplomatic courtesy, and what the tentacloids called superior slime management. "Chief Grimsby," the captain reported, "we've just completed the quarterly efficiency assessment for Alliance operations. The results are extraordinary." "How extraordinary?" "Resource productivity is up 847%, compared to pre-cooperation baseline measurements. Administrative overhead has decreased by 91%, and member satisfaction ratings are consistently above what the Blobertharians classify as optimal philosophical contentment levels. The Captain Maximizer consulted his data pad with the satisfaction of someone reporting genuinely good news. Most significantly, we've had requests from 47 additional civilizations asking to join the Alliance, not because they're being threatened or conquered, but because they genuinely want to participate in cooperative governance. This was unprecedented in galactic political history. Civilizations typically joined larger organizations either because they were forced to or because they needed protection from someone else who might force them. Voluntary participation based on genuine enthusiasm for the organizational principles was virtually unknown. What kind of civilizations are requesting membership? All kinds, Captain Maximizer replied. Advanced technological societies, agricultural communities, research-focused organizations, artistic collectives. The only common factor is that they've all studied our cooperative protocols and decided they want to be part of something that actually works. Grimsby nodded approvingly while finishing his corridor maintenance. This was exactly what he had expected would happen once civilizations started experiencing the benefits of cooperative rather than competitive relationships. Any problems with the new applications? Only one. The bureaucratic complexity empire has submitted a membership application that's 17,000 pages long and requires approval from 43 different committees using procedures that nobody fully understands. Grimsby sighed. Let me guess. They want to join the Cooperative Alliance, but they want to do it through the most complicated and inefficient process possible. Exactly. Their application includes detailed proposals for establishing subcommittees to study the feasibility of forming working groups, to evaluate the potential for developing procedures, to consider the possibility of maybe eventually participating in some aspects of cooperative governance. Send them a one-page form asking 3 questions. What can you contribute? What do you need? Are you willing to help solve problems instead of creating them? And if they can't answer those questions simply, then they're not ready for membership in an organization that values practical efficiency over bureaucratic complexity. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the station's communication system. The voice belonged to Bruticus, who was now serving as the Alliance's chief coordinator of voluntary cooperation. Attention Nexus Station Alpha personnel and visitors. We are pleased to announce the completion of the new interspecies recreation facility, designed collaboratively by representatives from all 93 member civilizations. The facility includes environmental zones optimized for the recreational needs of over 200 different species, meditation areas tuned to crystalline harmonizer frequency preferences, philosophy discussion chambers designed to contain Blobertharian intellectual emissions, and what the Flurborgs have requested we describe only as specialized wellness facilities. The announcement continued with details about scheduling procedures, usage protocols, and safety considerations for beings with various biological requirements. But what struck Grimsby was the tone. Bruticus sounded genuinely happy, not the aggressive satisfaction of someone who had conquered something, but the quiet contentment of someone who had helped build something valuable. "Chief Grimsby," Captain Maximizer said, "the Supreme Coordinator has asked me to invite you to the facility dedication ceremony this afternoon. Will there be speeches?" "Well, yes. Long speeches?" "The Blobertharians have prepared a philosophical presentation on the sociological implications of interspecies recreational cooperation. Ambassador Globnik plans to read a poem he's composed about the transcendent beauty of properly organized leisure activities. And the crystalline harmonizers want to perform a ceremonial song that celebrates the acoustic engineering achievements of the facility." Grimsby considered this while packing up his cleaning supplies. Dedication ceremonies were not typically his preferred way to spend an afternoon, but these particular speeches would probably be interesting, and the facility itself represented exactly the kind of practical problem-solving that he most appreciated. "I'll be there," he said, "but I'm bringing earplugs in case the harmonizers get too enthusiastic about their acoustic engineering." The dedication ceremony turned out to be everything Grimsby had expected and several things he hadn't. The facility itself was genuinely impressive, a masterpiece of collaborative engineering that somehow managed to accommodate the radically different environmental needs of hundreds of species in a single integrated complex. The Blobotherian philosophical presentation was surprisingly insightful, focusing on what they called the practical beauty of functional cooperation. Ambassador Globnik's poetry was actually quite good, particularly his observations about the sublime mathematics of shared space optimization. And the crystalline harmonizer's ceremonial song was beautiful enough to make several attendees weep with appreciation. But the most remarkable moment came when Bruticus took the stage to deliver what everyone expected would be a formal dedication address. Instead, he simply said, "3 months ago, I thought power meant making other people do what you wanted them to do. Today, I've learned that real power means helping other people do what they want to do. This facility exists because everyone involved wanted to create something that would make life better for everyone involved. That's the only kind of power worth having." The applause that followed was not the polite recognition typically given to ceremonial speeches. It was the genuine appreciation of beings who had experienced the difference between forced cooperation and voluntary collaboration. After the ceremony, Grimsby found himself surrounded by representatives from dozens of civilizations, all asking questions about facility management, cooperative governance, and what the tentacloids were calling applied practical wisdom methodologies. The questions were thoughtful, and the conversations were productive, but after 2 hours of explaining the same basic principles over and over again, Grimsby began to understand why so many people preferred complicated theories over simple practices. Simple practices required people to actually do things. Complicated theories allowed them to spend endless time talking about doing things without ever getting around to the doing part. He was pondering this distinction when he was approached by a being he didn't recognize, a tall, graceful creature with iridescent skin and the kind of serene expression that suggested either profound wisdom or very effective medication. "Chief Grimsby," the being said in a voice that sounded like wind chimes having a philosophical discussion, "I am Serenity Harmonizer of the Peaceful Contemplation Collective. We have been observing the transformation of the Vorthakian Alliance with great interest." "Oh." "We represent a coalition of civilizations that have traditionally avoided contact with aggressive expansionist empires. But we have been intrigued by your methodologies, and we would like to propose a collaborative research project." Grimsby's experience with collaborative research projects had taught him to be cautious. "What kind of research?" "We want to study the practical applications of custodial wisdom in interstellar diplomacy. Specifically, we're interested in developing standardized protocols for what we're calling maintenance-based conflict resolution." The concept was intriguing enough that Grimsby set down his cleaning supplies and gave Serenity Harmonizer his full attention. "Go on." "Our preliminary analysis suggests that most interspecies conflicts arise from what you might call social messes, misunderstandings, unaddressed needs, and accumulated grievances that could be resolved through proper maintenance procedures. We believe your approach could be systematized and taught to diplomatic personnel throughout the galaxy." The idea had merit. Grimsby had noticed that successful diplomacy often came down to the same skills that made for effective facility management: anticipating problems before they became serious, addressing issues promptly when they arose, and maintaining consistent standards for acceptable behavior. What would this research involve? We would like to establish a series of diplomatic training facilities where representatives from various civilizations could learn maintenance-based problem-solving techniques. We're calling it the Galactic Custodial Diplomacy Program. Grimsby considered this proposal while observing the ongoing dedication celebration around them. Representatives from dozens of civilizations were engaged in productive conversations, sharing ideas and working together to solve practical problems, all because someone had finally figured out that cooperation was more efficient than conflict. "I'm interested," he said finally, "but I have some conditions." "Name them." "First, no bureaucracy. The program has to be simple, practical, and focused on results rather than procedures. Second, no theoretical frameworks that make simple things sound complicated. Third, everyone who participates has to actually do maintenance work. You can't understand custodial principles without getting your hands dirty. Serenity Harmonizer's iridescent skin shifted to a warmer tone, which Grimsby had learned to interpret as agreement among members of the Peaceful Contemplation Collective. Those conditions are entirely acceptable. In fact, they're exactly what we were hoping you would say. And that's how Grimsby Snodgrass, who had originally just wanted to keep his corridors clean and his various alien residents comfortable, found himself becoming the galaxy's first professor of applied custodial diplomacy. The program that emerged from this collaboration would eventually train over 10,000 diplomatic personnel from across the galaxy in what became known as the Grimsby method of practical problem-solving. The curriculum was elegantly simple. Identify the mess, determine what caused it, apply appropriate cleaning solutions, and establish procedures to prevent the same mess from happening again. The techniques were so effective that within 5 years, interstellar conflicts had decreased by 78%, while voluntary cooperative agreements had increased by over 400%. But perhaps the most significant transformation was cultural. Throughout the galaxy, civilizations began to evaluate their own behaviors through what historians later called the custodial lens, asking themselves whether their actions were creating problems for other people to clean up or contributing to solutions that benefited everyone involved. The question became a standard part of diplomatic training, strategic planning, and even personal decision-making. Am I helping to clean up the mess, or am I making it worse? 10 years after the infamous custodial revolution, Grimsby was back where it all started, in Maintenance Corridor C7 of Nexus Station Alpha. The station had grown to accommodate representatives from over 500 civilizations, all participating in what was now the largest voluntary cooperative alliance in recorded galactic history. The corridor itself had been designated as a historic landmark, with a small plaque commemorating the location where practical wisdom changed the galaxy. Grimsby had tried to get them to remove the plaque. It interfered with proper floor cleaning procedures, but the Galactic Historical Preservation Society had insisted it was too important to relocate. As he applied his latest formula for removing what the Blobotherians now called inspirational philosophy residue, a byproduct of their excitement about the success of custodial diplomacy, Grimsby reflected on how much the galaxy had changed. Wars had largely been replaced by collaborative problem-solving sessions. Conquest had given way to cooperative expansion programs. Fear-based governance had been superseded by what everyone now called maintenance-centered leadership. It wasn't perfect, of course. The bureaucratic complexity empire was still submitting 17,000-page applications for simple membership requests. The aggressive posturing federation continued to insist that diplomatic negotiations required dramatic lighting and background music. And the Philosophical Overcomplification Society had recently published a 4-volume analysis of the theoretical implications of floor cleaning that completely missed the point of actually cleaning floors. But overall, the galaxy had become a more efficient, more comfortable, and significantly cleaner place to live. Grimsby had just finished applying neutralizing solution to a particularly stubborn patch of fossilized administrative confusion when his communication device chimed with an incoming priority message. "Chief Grimsby," came the familiar voice of Bruticus, who was now serving as the Alliance's Director of Voluntary Expansion Protocols. "We have a situation that requires your attention." "What kind of situation?" "The incredibly destructive empire of malicious hostility has been observing our cooperative expansion protocols for the past 2 years. They've submitted a formal request to join the Alliance." Grimsby paused in his cleaning activities. The incredibly destructive empire was notorious throughout the galaxy for their commitment to causing as much chaos and suffering as possible while expanding their territory through the most violent means available. "Let me guess," he said. "They want all the benefits of cooperative membership, but they don't want to give up any of their destructive behaviors." "Actually, no. According to their application, they want to completely restructure their entire civilization around cooperative principles. They say they're tired of spending all their energy on destruction and they want to learn how to build things instead." This was genuinely surprising. The incredibly destructive empire had built their entire cultural identity around the concept that causing suffering was the highest form of achievement. What changed their minds? According to their Emperor, Supreme Destroyer Annihilation Maximum, they've been analyzing our efficiency statistics. Apparently, they've realized that cooperative civilizations consistently outperform destructive ones across every metric that matters: resource productivity, technological advancement, population satisfaction, even military effectiveness when it's actually needed. And they want to completely change their approach. They've already begun the process. They've established what they're calling constructive transformation protocols throughout their empire. Their military forces are being retrained as infrastructure development specialists. Their conquest fleets are being converted into exploration and assistance vessels. They've even renamed themselves the Cooperative Construction Alliance of Helpful Intent. Grimsby set down his cleaning supplies and considered this development. The transformation of the incredibly destructive empire would be one of the most remarkable political changes in galactic history, and also one of the most challenging integration projects the Alliance had ever attempted. What do they need from us? Everything. They want comprehensive training in cooperative governance, resource-sharing protocols, diplomatic courtesy procedures, and what they specifically requested as advanced maintenance-based problem-solving techniques. And are they willing to actually do the work? Emperor Maximum has personally enrolled in the Galactic Custodial Diplomacy Program. He starts classes next week. The image of the galaxy's most feared destroyer taking notes on proper slime removal techniques was amusing enough to make Grimsby smile. "Approve their application," he said, "but put them on probationary status for the first year. Changing from destructive to constructive behaviors is possible, but it takes time to develop new habits." "Already done. And Chief, there's one more thing." "What's that?" "The Galactic Cooperative Council has voted to establish a new position: Director of Universal Maintenance and Practical Problem Resolution. They want to offer it to you." Grimsby considered this while resuming his corridor cleaning activities. The position would involve overseeing custodial diplomacy programs for the entire galaxy, establishing maintenance-based governance protocols for thousands of civilizations, and probably dealing with more bureaucratic complexity than any reasonable person should have to endure. "Do I get to keep cleaning floors?" "That would be entirely up to you." "Then I accept. But I'm keeping my regular maintenance schedule. Some jobs are too important to delegate." And so it was that Grimsby Snodgrass, who had started the day as a simple janitor trying to keep his corridors clean, ended it as the galaxy's director of universal maintenance and practical problem resolution, a position that came with unlimited resources, galaxy-wide authority, and the responsibility for ensuring that civilizations throughout the known universe learned to clean up their own messes. The appointment was announced at what the Galactic Historical Record Department insisted on calling the most significant administrative ceremony in recorded history. Representatives from over 800 civilizations attended, including several who had traveled from distant galaxies specifically to observe what they had heard described as the ultimate practical wisdom event. But the moment that everyone remembered from the ceremony wasn't any of the formal speeches or elaborate presentations. It was Grimsby's acceptance address, which lasted exactly 37 seconds and consisted of a single sentence that would be quoted in diplomatic training programs for the next 1,000 years. When asked to share his philosophy of leadership with the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, Grimsby simply said, "Clean up your own mess, help others clean up theirs, and remember that the universe is a much nicer place when everyone takes responsibility for leaving it better than they found it."